Hello, adventurers, and welcome back to the Babbling Bard. I hope those who saw the prologue to Bookshops and Bonedust enjoyed it, though I found that there were a few technical difficulties, and rest be assured that we will have the prologue revamped with the needed special sound effects. But otherwise, I hope you liked it. Today we're going to try to cover chapters 1 and 2, depending on how well I can verbalize words without stuttering or mumbling, so I apologize in advance. And I think that's all the announcements I have, so without further ado, let's jump into chapter 1. On with the adventure. Chapter 1. Viv lay on the floor of the tiny room. Well, almost on the floor. The place hadn't been built with orcs in mind, and the bed was too short by at least 2 feet. Someone had wrestled the straw-thick mattress onto the floor, and though her legs still went off the end, they positioned her pack so her foot was propped, keeping the wounded leg elevated. It hurt like all 8 hells. She'd caught a fever while bouncing along in the litter behind a pack mule, coughing all through the dust she could raise, which was a lot. Viv might have been bedbound for 2 days, in and out of consciousness, a muddle of circular dreams and throbbing agony. The surgeon had come and gone multiple times, or maybe he hadn't, and she'd just been hallucinating it over and over. She half remembered the man's face, tangled up in a shame she couldn't identify. Now, her head was clear, which mostly meant she could almost feel everything with complete clarity. It was a debatable improvement. What's more, she was absolutely ravenous. Staring around the room, the place was mostly barren. A crude bed frame and a tiny table with a lantern basin on it. Gray raw woods for walls. A small slated window. She smelled the sea and the dry beach grass and fish. An old sea chest sat opposite. Her saber leaned against it, out alongside a crude wooden crutch. Her maul was missing. There wasn't much else worth considering. The building was absolutely quiet. The only sounds came from outside, the hissing of grass, the remote grumble of waves, and the occasional call of a seabird. Viv had been lucid for less than a single hour, and she thought the view might drive her insane if she had to endure another. Her leg was cleanly wrapped at least, splinted so the knee wouldn't bend. Her trouser leg had been cut away. The bandages showed some discoloration which she'd oozed through, but it was a big step from the moss and dirty wool shirt. Well, she said. Shit. She made it up by degrees, hauling her butt onto the bed frame and sucking air through her teeth as she swung her damaged leg around. Her left foot fit, but the right foot was so swollen it would have to stay bare. Tottering to her feet, she made it to the basin of tepid water, where she scrubbed herself as best she could with the rags she found there. Feeling less foul, she limped toward the door, but each thud of her heel against the floor pulsed back at the edges of her vision. Gritting her teeth, she changed direction and grudgingly seized the crutch. It galled her to admit how much better that was. While she was there, she belted on her saber out of habit. Unfortunately, she discovered that the room was at the top of a flight of narrow stairs. She fumbled down them, catching herself every other step with the crutch. Her saber did nothing to make things easier. With every impact, she found a new, more colorful epithet for Rackham. Not that it was his fault, of course. Still, it was a lot more satisfying to curse someone by name, even if that name could have been her own. She could smell the ghost of bacon as she descended, which was plenty of incentive to carry on. The stairs opened to a long, rough-timbered dining area in an inn or tavern, or whatever they call it around here. A big stone hearth crouched cold along one wall, yawning like a disappointed mouth. An iron chandelier hung askew, entombed in candle wax. Glass floats and storm lanterns were strung or nailed up in the rafters, alongside netting and weathered oars with names carved into them. A handful of scar tables were unoccupied. A long bar ran along the back wall, and the tavern keep leaned against it, idly cleaning a copper mug. He looked bored as the place warranted. The tall sea-faced chin was grizzled gray. His nose was a hatchet, his hair hung kelp-thick past sharp ears, and his forearms writhed with tattoos. "Morning, miss," he grumbled. "Breakfast?" Viv couldn't remember anyone ever calling her miss. His gaze sketched over her, brows rising as he spied the saber, then returned to the mug he was polishing. "Bacon?" asked Viv. He nodded. "Eggs, too? Potatoes?" Her stomach grumbled aggressively. "Here, 5 bits ought to do it." She patted at her belt for her wallet, looked toward the stairs, and swore. "I'll get it next time. Worst case, I climb those stairs myself." The man smiled wryly. "Don't think you could outrun me, could you? You'd better fall onto one of these stools while you still can." Viv was so used to her very existence being an obvious threat that it was honestly startling to hear a casual joke at her expense, even such a mild one. She supposed clunking around on one leg tended to dull one's fearsomeness. As she accomplished the suggested maneuver, he disappeared into the back. Viv dragged another stool close enough to prop her bare foot on one of its low supports. Drumming her fingers on the counter, she tried to distract herself by studying the interior further, but there really wasn't much else worth marketing. The sounds and smells from the back were all her mind could dwell on. When the tavern keeper brought out a skillet and set it on the counter along with a fork and napkin, she almost seized the hot handle with her bare hand in a hurry to drag it closer. The hash of potatoes, crispy, fatty pork, and 2 runny eggs were still sizzling and popping. She almost burst into joyful tears. Viv caught him watching her devour the food from the other end of the bar and tried to slow down, but the potatoes were salty and rich with the egg, and it was hard not to shovel it in without pausing. The noises she made as she ate were not polite, but they were definitely sincere. "Feel better?" the Fae asked as he slid this empty pan off the bar top. "Gods, yes. And thanks. I'm Viv." That wry grin again. "Heard when you came in. We met, actually, but I'm not surprised you don't remember. Not with all the commotion." She didn't remember the commotion, but his amused tone made her wonder. "So, did the Ravens pay up my stay?" "Hoped I'd see Rackham himself," said the barkeep. "Still, the fellow he sent you put you up with practically a gentleman. Paid 4 days. Said you'd be able to put it past that on brand." He held out a hand, and she shook it. They both had hard grips. "Back to your ease, then?" he asked. "Hells no, I'd go crazy. Where exactly am I?" His wry grin went all the way to amused. "Let me be the first to welcome you to Merk, capital of the western... not capital, jewel of the western coast. A very small part of the western coast. And this here is the Perch, my place." "Seems awfully quiet around here," she said, almost depressingly quiet. "We have our loud moments when the boats are in, but if you're looking to rest and recover, most days you're not going to be bothered by the noise." She nodded and hopped onto her good foot, easing the crutch back under her. "Well, thanks again. Guess I'll be seeing a lot of you." With hot food in her belly, Viv almost felt herself. The thought of hobbling her way around a little of the town was a lot more attractive than it had been a few minutes ago. She rapped a knuckle on the counter. "I think I'll take in the sights." "See you in 10 minutes, then," said Brand. Viv laughed, but she had to force it. Chapter 2. As Viv lurched off the porch, grabbing one of the new old posts for ballots, she glanced back. A battered sign hung under the shingled awning, bearing an indifferently carved fish, with "The Perch" chiseled above it and staying dark. A light sea breeze teased her curls into her face, and she gazed over what she could see of Merk. The ocean was visible for 3/4 of the horizon, until it was obscured by a tall, chalky bluff to the north. She could discern the barest sketch of some small structures and fences, but not enough to identify their purpose. Dunes swelled back from the shore in flattening waves, crested by shaggy fringes on sea grass. An old stone fortress wall surrounded most of Merk proper, marching uphill, with the town tucked inside. The Perch wasn't within its protective encirclement, but on a sandy upslope beside the southern road, a affording a view over the ramparts. Outside the walls and nearer to the perch, long ranks of narrow buildings curved in dwindling arcs toward the beach. Their clapboard sides were bleached pearly gray by sun and salt mist, burnished silver in the late morning light. Uneven boardwalks stitched them together, and old, sparsely cobbled roads wound between, sifting over with sand in places. 4 long piers extended out into the sea, jumbled with crates and ringing. Fishing boats nibbled against the pilings like minnows after bread, while bigger ships piled the waters beyond. A few tiny figures moved on the piers, and their faint calls rebounded across the water. The whole city seemed half asleep. She doubted it ever woke up. A sudden powerful sense of being left behind swamped Viv. Rackham had dumped her in this misbegotten borderlands, but in the wild uncertainty crawled up from her gut that he never planned to come back this way. It was all a convenient excuse to be rid of some troublesome kid. She gritted her teeth and wrestled that feeling back down into the dark. As Viv limped out of the shade, her full weight of the sun fell upon her. Not noon yet, but getting close. She closed her eyes and soaked it in for a moment, trying to enjoy the heat on her skin. Drawing in a huge breath of the sea air, she let it out swell. Well, she said to herself, let's get this over with. Navigating the cobbles with the crutch was tricky, but she was glad that they were there, because sand alone would have been far worse. Her progress was glacial, but methodical, and her underarm was already chafing at the unfamiliar crutch. She'd have to unwrap it in something until she could get rid of the damned thing entirely. The slope was downward but slight, which was a blessing. Gulls started from the dunes that climbed on either side of the road. For a wonder, the first person Viv saw was another orc. He tromped stolidly toward her, dragging a wagon behind him, with the traces tucked under his arms. His chest and head were bare, and his shoulders crisscrossed with old scars. Bundles of driftwood and split kindling were stacked in the wagon. "Morning," she said, offering a joking salute with her unoccupied hand. He nodded as he passed, his eyes flickering to her sword, and she stopped to watch him go. He didn't look back, which vexed her for some reason. The first building she reached were a series of shops that led down to the beach, where a network of wooden causeways made the sand more navigable. She maneuvered up onto the boardwalk connecting the shop fronts. Every impact of her crutch on the salt-blasted wood was like a hoofbeat. Most of the shops were tall and narrow, and seemed to be leaning away from the breeze off the ocean. Up close, the clapboard and shingles were shaggy with splinters. The first few businesses were closed permanently, judging by the cracked glass with tarps or printed paper pinned inside. Printed was a word I'd loved. Then a bookshop of sorts. Through a pair of narrow front windows, she spied chaotic piles of books, charts, and miscellaneous junk. She could almost see the smell of mildew. The door had once been red, but was now streaked with nothing but the memory of a color. A little sign to the left read, "Thistlebur Booksellers." She shook her head and hobbled on. A sailmender's, then a junk shop crammed with shells, sand dollars, glass floats, and nautical flotsam and jetsam. Viv couldn't imagine why anyone would want of it. She caught a whiff of baking on the breeze, cutting through the pungent odors of brine and seaweed. Not surprisingly, she was already hungry again. The effort of getting around and the demands of a healing body notwithstanding, Viv burned hot, and her late breakfast was nearly consumed in the furnace of her belly. At the very end of this strip of shops was the first real sign of life she'd seen, unless you'd counted the stone-faced orc hauling firewood, which she didn't. This place was at least double the width of the others, with 2 chimneys puffing away and folks actually coming and going. Sea Song Bakery was stenciled on the glass, and the letters looked tidy and freshly painted. Not that you needed anything more than your nose to figure out what the shop was about. Woven baskets crammed with big round loaves, buns, and biscuits shone through the window. A bell over the door tinkled as a dwarf with a sailor's swagger emerged, cramming the last of something into his mouth. Viv peered inside for a minute, cursing herself again for leaving her wallet in her room. The gigantic, flaky biscuits promised to exceed the lofty expectations the scent had already set. She wiped her lips with the back of her forearm and turned reluctantly away. Pa had always told her that hunger could be cured with sweat one way or the other. She began lurching her way determinedly across the sand-washed road. Most of the buildings on the other side seemed to be residences, or maybe lodgings for vacationers. Nobody seemed to be about, though. The long hitching post ran along the road, and that would do well enough for what she wanted. She spent several days on her back, and her body made sure she felt it. Not that she'd been running foot races any time soon, but you could hardly expect to stay alive slinging steel if you didn't keep your own edges sharp. Leaning her crutch and saber against one end, she gingerly swung herself under the main beam, gripping it overhand. She stretched her legs out into the street, wincing as pain spiked along her right thigh. She lowered herself until her elbows nearly locked. Then she pulled herself up, over and over, warmth building on her back, chest, and upper arms. The pain in her leg drifted into the aft of her mind. When her biceps quivered with the strain and sweat traced her temples, she loaded herself onto her rear, tucking in the heel of her left leg and letting herself breathe heavy and even. The orc with the wagon of firewood was staring at her, stopped on his way back downhill. His cart was a lot emptier now. A variety of worn tools dangled from hooks along its slated sides. A maul, a sledge, an axe, a saw. Viv narrowed her eyes at him. "What are you looking at?" He shrugged, and when he responded his voice was deep, but surprisingly mellow. "Back at it awful soon." "Did I already meet you when I got here too?" He shrugged again. "Not a lot going on most days. Hard not to notice when something exciting happens. It was pretty exciting, the shadow of a grin. He almost strangled Highlark." "Highlark?" "The surgeon." "Oh," she replied with a wince. "Well, that wasn't ideal." "Pitts," he said, indicating himself. Then he ducked his head, hitched the traces higher, and tugged the wagon into motion. He didn't wait for her to offer her own name. She found that vaguely annoying. "Viv!" she hollered after him. He just nodded without looking back. "Eight hells," said Viv. "Great town. You can see why everybody stays." She struggled to her feet, gathering her crutch and saber. She went to the end of the boardwalk, retreating out of sight into a valley between two dunes. She couldn't see the water. The wind was cut off completely, and the stillness itched at her so much that she tossed the crutch into the sand and limped to the crest of the beachward dune, hissing in pain the whole way. The breeze up there was sweeter, and she gave her breath a minute to even out before unsheathing her saber. Viv tried to execute a couple of sword forms, keeping her weight mostly to her undamaged leg. She hoped to at least manage a few sets of transitions from high to low to feint, focusing on precision and upper body work, but it was a lost cause. Her leading leg shifted suddenly, and when she rocked back, the weight of the blade forced her onto the weak heel, and then she was tumbling over in a plume of sand and profanity. 5 minutes after her embarrassing flail down the dune, she stumbled back onto the main thoroughfare. Angry, thwarted, and keenly aware of the mix of sand and sweat up inside her shirt, she started the grueling trek up the hill toward the perch. The gentle slope was more of a trial than it had any right to be, and all she had to look forward to at the end was an empty inn, an empty room, and a set of very narrow stairs. She should have been shoulder to shoulder with the ravens. She should have been hacking her way closer to Vereen. She should have been anywhere but here. With most of her attention fixed on the sand-covered cobbles and where she'd next place the crutch, she was startled when a shadow stepped into view. Glancing up, she found herself staring into the slitted serpent eyes of a Tapenti. The woman wasn't as tall as Viv, a few people were, but situated upslope, Viv had to look up at her. Or maybe it just felt that way. She was powerfully built, the delicate patterns of her hide sculpted over muscular shoulders and legs. Her scaly hood flared along her temples and neck, salmon where the light glowed through it, and the long, rattle-like braids of her hair slithered dryly in the breeze. The lantern of a gate warden gleamed where it hung at her waist opposite a longsword, and she wore a badge on her blue tunic. The woman cocked her head in a way Viv couldn't interpret as anything but disdainful. A stunning display of martial prowess. Her eyes darted beyond Viv to the crest of the dune and the site of her aborted blade practice. Viv's skin crawled in a hot flush, the kind that could tip from embarrassment into rage with no more than a feather's weight. She wasn't fool enough to let it happen, not with the local law. but she didn't have to be polite either. Guess there's not much else to look at, huh? The Tapenti smiled thinly and her eyes narrowed. It's a sight I'd rather not see around my city. I like it quiet, and little girls hauling swords around promise to be noisy. I suggest you keep your steel sheathed, or better yet, back to your room. No reason you shouldn't stay there too, in my estimation. Viv sputtered. Little girl? The gate warden rode over her roughshod, her voice a relentless hiss. When they dragged you in, I took one look at you and knew I'd need to watch you. Highlark certainly won't forget your arrival anytime soon. If you cause the slightest trouble here, I won't hesitate to toss you in a cell to ride out your convalescence until your friends show up to take you off my hands. Viv could only stare in mute fury. Her hand twitched toward her saber's hilt, but she mastered the impulse even as she saw the Tapendi's eyes follow the motion with grim amusement. Good day. The woman tilted her head mockingly toward the inn. And be careful on your way up the hill. A bad fall might extend your stay, and neither of us would want that, would we? Then she was gone, and Viv could only stare up the street toward the perch and fervently long for something to stab. If Rackham didn't come back soon, she'd have to leave and find him herself before she did something she might really regret. And that is chapters 1 and 2 of Bookshops and Bonedust. Things are really starting to stir up in Merc, especially with Viv around, it seems. I'm really hoping you'll be back next week, or maybe as soon as the weekend for chapters 3 and 4. I'm going to be trying to get this as much as I can with my schedule and academic life, etc., etc. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me be the first to say, be sure to like this podcast, add it to your playlist if you want, like and subscribe to the channel, and yeah, I hope to see you again soon. Have a good night, adventurers.